Thank you very much, everyone, for coming here in the evening. To everyone online and in the room, welcome to the Data-Driven Parent, the role of digital monitoring technologies in caring for adolescents. I'm delighted to have here today Professor Ekaterina Nash and Professor Netta Weinstein joining me today to discuss how parental control technologies affect family relationships from the perspective of adolescents aged 16 to 17 in the UK. I'm Professor Ekaterina Hertog. Most of you probably have seen me around. I'm an associate professor in AI and society here at the OII, and my research interests lie at the intersection of digital sociology and family sociology. Professor Victoria Nash is the director and an associate professor and senior policy fellow here at the OII. And Professor Netta Weinstein, is a professor at the University of Reading and a psychologist with a background in clinical and social psychology. So we all have sort of compatible but slightly different perspectives, all located within social sciences, but taking slightly different takes. That might become more clearer in our presentations. And if you have questions, feel free to reach out to us individually, particularly if you're interested in different aspects of it. For your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website following the event. The presentation will run for about 30 to 40 minutes, followed by discussion at the end. If you're joining us online, please put your questions into the Q&A box. And those in the room, save your questions until the end, and we'll answer them after the talk. If you wish to ask questions with your mic or camera on, please raise your hand during the Q&A, and we'll call you on so you can kind of join us on camera. Finally, be aware that if you're joining us on camera, this will end up being included in the recording. Okay, I think hopefully I'm done with the housekeeping now. Thanks everyone. And I need to highlight that this project was very much supported by Freya Hope as well, who is not here with us today. She is a DPhil student at the anthropology department here at Oxford. Okay, so just to set up the scene very briefly, I think one of the background facts for this presentation is that across the global north, we've been observing that the time parents spend doing childcare has been sort of inexorably on the rise. First, this trend was largely limited to more educated parents, so college-educated parents, but it's actually in the recent decades, it has spread and is now affects, at least in the global north countries for which we have the data, it affects families across the educational spectrum. This has been happening at the same time as children's lives have been moving more increasingly online. And again, just as one illustration, this comes from the UK, from the Ofcom report published in 2023. This just records mobile phone ownership by age. And many of these phones, especially in cases for the older children, these are smartphones rather than just simple dumb phones. As you can see, mobile phone ownership is fairly low at young ages, but by the age of 12, almost every child in the UK has a phone. Most of the time, this is a smartphone. So our population is kind of here. This is really 100%. They all have mobile phones. And I didn't record the graph, but coming from the same report, young people do a lot of things with their phones. They they use it for messages, they produce creative content, they watch videos, and so on. And all of this has been sort of associated with the pressure on the parents to try to follow their kids online, to perhaps sort of offer support there and ensure their young people's safety. So how to do this within this context? Well, digital monitoring technologies have been often positioned as something that might be the answer to this conundrum. So just to clarify, what do we mean by digital monitoring technologies? Well, these is technologies that are often colloquially referred to as parental controls. This is a broad category of apps used by parents and guardians to collect information and or restrict behaviors of their children, usually. They have multiple functionalities. They're quite diverse. They can track children's or young people's online activities. They can limit children's time on certain apps of websites or even block apps of websites completely, sort of censorship and filtering capabilities. they can impose certain or promote certain schedules. Again, this could be done in a very harsh way when your devices shut down, so the Wi-Fi shuts down at a certain time when it's bedtime, or they could send like little reminders, it's getting late, you should start thinking about going to bed. They can also be used to track young people's location online and so on. So this is the broad kind of category of technologies that we've been interested in exploring in this project. So are these technologies a solution? Well, a growing number of parents potentially seem to be thinking so. At least the use of these technologies is getting more widespread. Parents are very worried about their children's online lives. And again, I think this is from the 2024 Ofcom report, only 42% of UK parents trust their 16 to 17-year-olds. I really especially looked for the numbers for the older teens, trust these young people to behave sensibly online. So, which means they feel the pressure to monitor and restrict them in some kinds of ways. There is a general kind of increased normative pressure on parents to invest in their children's safety, especially in the digital safety. 77% of UK parents with children aged 8 to 15 use some kind of technology to control online content that their children are exposed to. These technologies can be quite contentious. Location tracking. 40% use location tracking to monitor their children's whereabouts, according to a different survey. And I think I was quite pleased with this New Yorker cartoon. I think this is the imaginary that the parents, this is the situation the parents are imagining. So once they remove the phones from their young people, they become accomplished violinists, for example, or achieve in some other way. The reality, of course, is much more complicated than that. An important context for this is, of course, this technology have a multitude of ethical concerns associated with them. For example, scholars in philosophy, in human-computer interaction, and surveillance studies, and critical data studies have been really engaging with this and raising these concerns, highlighting that these technologies make children's privacy infringement much easier, and these infringements can come both from companies that promoting or being one of the facets of surveillance capitalism, datifying minors' data and capitalizing on it after all. But it also can lead to privacy infringements within families, where these technologies allow parents sort of a look into their children's lives that has never been possible before. And that could sort of cross over to children have rights, children's human rights, and discussions of that. So there is a big background question. Is it even desirable? Is it ethically? Should we be thinking about our values as society, children's rights? Is it even desirable to monitor children through digital devices? This is a very important background question. There are a number of scholars working in this field. We are leaving it here as an important context. We are not, in our own research, we don't study that directly, because this has been done and is being done by colleagues already. But this is something that maybe we need to be coming back to as we discuss in the discussion of these technologies, and perhaps particularly in policy recommendations. Okay, segueing into the policy landscape, Vicky will talk a lot more about it towards the end of this presentation, but just to highlight, so the discussions within the sort of policy and regulatory field, and again, correct me if I'm missing something, but has very much focused on children's well-being, but without much of a consideration how digital parenting strategies might change family dynamics. Governments throughout the world, not just in the UK, very much emphasize safety tech. UK specifically is trying to position itself as the safest place to be online, both for children and perhaps for adults. And that often comes, as part of that, we see a regulatory push towards for digital monitoring tools. So I think France has mandated those to be available for any tech as part of any technology provided or aimed at children. But at the same time, there's limited discussion of what these monitoring tools are achieving, what's the cost of parents sort of enforcing those and restricting children in certain ways. There's very little discussion of children's autonomy and self-regulation, because a lot of these tools are currently seem to be being used or sort of highlighting the capabilities for restricting children, controlling them, shutting them down externally, rather than promoting their digital literacy, promoting their autonomy, teaching them to regulate their technology use. And very little space is given to young people's voices. So we hear a lot from the experts, we hear quite a lot from the parents, we hear much less from young people. And so this project aims to come into this space, give voice to young people's considerations, to their experiences, and highlight the experience and potentially inform of the research space and the policy making in the future. Okay, so how to make sense of young people's experiences of digital monitoring? This is very much a qualitative project, so it was a little bit, it's actually putting theoretical framework before discussing our results, puts our process upside down. So in reality, these concepts came up very much from our analysis of the results of our focus groups, but I thought that I would just signpost it to you here that the concepts that came up as really important in informing our understanding and making sense of what young people are telling us is that, first of all, the affordances of technology and how the affordances of parental control technologies first transform connective labor that is part of childcare. So the connective labor concept comes from sociologist Alison Pugh, the American sociologist, and it's largely about communication. It refers to the connective labor as part of care, where it's a labor that's involved into the care and the person being cared for sort of see and be seen by each other. So the additional aspect to communication, perhaps, is this joint, it's a collaborative labor where two parties are involved. So it's not just parents communicating the law or imposing the rules on young people, but also giving young people an opportunity to communicate their views, to communicate their experiences, to be involved in changing that process. So, throughout, as we're starting to present your results, you'll see that parental control technologies and the affordances that it gives to the parents can change the nature of this connected labor, or even make it seem less necessary. And I can't help but show you this. This is a screenshot from a very popular location tracking app. Some of you might be familiar with it. It's Life 360. This is just a marketing grab. Like it's still on the website. If you go, you can see it. So connective labor is communicating, talking to the young person, learning about their situation. Well, this app tells you don't have to ask. You don't need to ask. You can get that information without having to ask. For example, where this is a location tracking app, so you don't need to ask your young person, how have you been today? Where did you go? You can just look. And on the one hand, it gives the parent the necessary information potentially that they were looking for, but it makes communication seemingly unnecessary. It kind of downgrades it as well. Another thing that's not really advertised on this screenshot, but we can potentially infer that it doesn't necessarily, sometimes this technology can be used without young person's awareness or consent. So again, you don't have to ask, you don't have to communicate, you possibly can put a track on your child and learn without that collaboration. So the affordances, the point about affordances that they don't have to be used. This is something that technology enable or make easier to achieve. You can choose not to use those affordances. So they're sort of structuring the reality or the nature of the task. And then we could see how many families make use of it. Maybe they transform and make use of these technologies differently without utilizing all of the possible technical capabilities. And another side to it is that how the affordances of parental controls interact with children's autonomy. And again, perhaps my comment here that some of these technologies can be used without young people's awareness and consent speaks a little bit to the capabilities that these technologies give to the parents and how they potentially change young people's ability to experience or to be autonomous and to sort of behave differently from what their parents want. And finally, how all of this, the implications, all of this have for parent-teen relationships. I showed you this already. Just quickly about how we are studying young people's experiences. Well, we've run 8 focus groups between November 2023 and January 2025. All the groups were facilitated by Vicky and me, most of the time together. They were all run in the UK. We've spoken to 16, 17-year-old young people. This is a qualitative project, so our sample is in no way representative, but we've aimed for diversity of voices. So our goal was to, we've sampled young people with the help of schools, so we looked for very different types of schools. So as you could see, from this list, we had a couple of private schools. One of them was boarding, so young people were physically away from their parents for a lot of the time. We had boys only and girls only schools. We had schools, very middle class, very wealthy, rural area in schools in inner London, schools with very high proportion of children on free school meals, which is a proxy for poverty rate. Very ethnically diverse schools as well. So we're not claiming that we're getting a representative spread of patterns, but we're hoping we're capturing a variety, as many voices as is possible, a variety of voices. It's not only middle-class families, for example, or not only white families, and so on. Okay, I will speak a little bit to our findings, and I'll hand over to my collaborators. As a sociologist, I was expecting loads of patterns by sociodemographics, and the big thing that I really thought I'll see is the gendered patterns. I thought boys and girls will be treated differently because parents will be worried about different sorts of risks. We found very limited gender differences in young people's experiences. Like, there were some differences we could see in location tracking, which was seen as generally more acceptable and more necessary for girls. As one young woman said, yeah, I feel like if I go out like clubbing, then I might actually give my parent my location. Being a girl, you understand everything that can happen. You're taught that at a very young age. So it was seen as more necessary for girls by both boys and girls that we spoke to. But however, it wasn't a huge difference. Boys get very much tracked too. Sometimes, as this young man, they even set it up, help the parents to set that up. So in one case, in this case, a young man got sort of tired from getting messages from his mom and set up location tracking of himself on her phone so that he could stop the messages, but she would stop worrying. We saw more differences by socioeconomic status, and also the cultural dimensions were quite evident in our conversations with young people. There was clearly a higher use of parental control technologies in richer families. So in private schools, where the families were the most wealthy, you had particularly a lot of those technologies were used perhaps most commonly. And then again, schools in more wealthy areas, these technologies seem to be more common. Some of it potentially came from the fact that desired technology use and how it needed to be restricted or not restricted looked very differently depending on the kind of background that the young people came from. So in one quote from a young woman that came from a school that was located in a very poor and potentially not very safe neighborhood in inner London, she was saying that, well, there's not many opportunities to be outside. And in my family, we've got, my mom's working, my dad's working, we live away from where we hang out, where our friends live. So we're left to our own devices. So potentially the implication is that there was a preference that young people stay inside and safe. There was not many, young people didn't feel much of a motivation to go out because their friends were not there. So there was no need to restrict the technology use and no need to location track them either, because that was a preferable solution for the families. There were also certain cultural differences that were very visible, and sometimes they interacted with gender. Like another young woman said, I think it's also kind of cultural when we asked her about how parents use this technology, is location tracking and digital monitoring. For example, in my culture, they are going to want to monitor me for the rest of my life, like until I'm married. And her life's probably over, I don't know. But with my brother, when he's a teenager, he's going to have more freedom. So there are these interesting patterns. However, as I'll hand over in a minute, we found a lot of, on an abstract level, a lot of similar themes emerging. And I think the rest of the conversation will focus more on those. But just to signpost here, I think more research is needed to also uncover these interesting patterns and differences in the population. And I'd like to call out Netta.
So I came into this really interested in the role that parental controls are playing in development and family relationships, the way that Katya and Vicky did. And, you know, I remember when we were talking about the results that they found, there were so many kind of interesting things from a family systems perspective that came out, how parents relate to their teens, how teens respond to the different ways that parents relate to them, what this means for kind of well-being, for autonomy. So, you know, these results are so exciting, and we've distilled some of them to hopefully start to explore these processes through these data. So, you know, one of the things
I forgot I was meant to speak about this. Sorry.
Oh,
Sorry. You'll do a better job.
We know a lot about this. I think that is redundant at this point. But one of the things that came out in these interviews is that, at least the way that young people are experiencing it, parents are often using parental controls for the things that they sound like to restrict behavior. And so, you know, GPS is used to make sure that young people, teens, aren't going where they shouldn't be going or where they might be unsafe. Filters are put on to prevent teens accessing certain sites that might be unsafe for them, or devices are blocked or turned off at certain times of the evening, for example, to facilitate sleep or to make sure that young people aren't online for too long. So inherently, these technologies are restrictive. They constrain behavior. But the kind of fascinating thing is that from teens' experiences, they don't always have to be restrictive. So they inherently restrict, but they're not always restrictive. And so that's one of the fascinating things that came out for us, which is that some teens saw parental controls as restrictive. That is, they felt like they were forced to do it. It was forced adoption. But for other ones, it felt more collaborative. They felt sort of free or autonomous within those constraints. So these are great illustrations. The first boy here said, you know, I probably better than I can. I think parents should have probably a better reason than, well, if you have a phone, you go by these rules, which, you know, as parents, I'm often tempted to use. I think you should be able to understand why the rules are in place. And so that ability to understand the importance of a parental control and why it's being used, how it's being used, is really important for getting buy-in for teens, not only understanding, but also being willing to collaborate and work with parents and feel okay within those restrictions. A second quote makes that really personal and really shows the power of communication to turn a restriction into something that does not feel restrictive. I think I have increased freedom because of Life 360. Because my parents say, if we can't track you, it'll be much worse. We don't know where you are and you don't pick up your phone, therefore you can't go. But if they can see where I am all the time, they say, you're able to go because we know it's safe, we know where you are. So for a young person, if they can really understand the utility of a restriction or a parenting control technology for what they want to achieve within their own lives, it can feel like independence and freedom and not control, not restriction. One of the things that came out is that, you know, when we talk about these kind of explanations that parents can give as rationales, They explain, well, I want you to use this, to have this on your phone, because then I feel more comfortable with you being out. I'm not going to worry, and you can go out longer. And a teen says, okay, I'm on board with that. That's cool with me. I'd rather have that option. But in order to deliver that kind of rationale or explanation well, a parent needs to also have shared understanding with the teen or young person. That is, they need to be able to take their perspective. And this came out for us as well. And one of the things that parents need to recognize is that young people will use technologies to achieve their own goals, to pursue things that are important to them, to pursue developmental challenges. And those can be connecting with friends, learning, being curious, exploring, expressing themselves in different ways, connecting with communities that help them understand themselves, and so on. And so with all these values and goals in technologies, when parents use restricting technologies, and they don't offer an explanation that recognizes the potential that online environments offer to young people, that's when we see potential tensions. So this is a great example. One young person said, "It is preventing socialization for me because parents go, okay, well, back in my day, I would have gone out with my friend." Well, it's not as easy as that, because I could suggest to my friends, oh, how about we go out and play football or something? But then if all my friends go, oh no, I'd rather go and play this game or my Xbox, and my parents have said, you're not allowed, then I'm missing out being with my friends. So in this example, if a parent gives a rationale or an explanation that says, well, you know, I do not want you to be on your Xbox because I want you to get exercise and go out and be active. But they miss the actual important bit for the young person. That is, this is an opportunity to connect with my friends. Then even an explanation is not going to land so well. It's not going to create that kind of buy-in collaboration. So it's not just providing an explanation, but it's also providing one that recognizes the young person's values and goals in their online use or offline use in the case of GPS and location tracking. What we find as well, what young people really suggested, is that whether or not you talk about parental controls as a parent, you know, whether you give explanations or not, even if you just use parental controls without any kind of good or bad explanations, there are going to be effects on young people. So they respond just to the use of parental controls. And some of those effects can be not beneficial, not conducive to the child's well-being, to their development, or to the relationship between the parents and the young people. One of the things that young people talked about in these interviews is having oppositional roles with their parents, that sense of tension, that there's a good guy and a bad guy. And because I'm being monitored, now the parent has some information about me, and we're now at odds with each other. So one person said, I think the importance is just knowing what they can see, kind of with the seeing searches, like what you're searching on Google. I think it becomes a bit challenging if you don't know and you're just kind of being caught out by your parents. And so the difficulty is if parents are using monitoring technologies without having conversation, then these kind of tensions exist and they're never talked about. You know, parents and teens are at odds in a way that's never communicated and then worked through among them. The other thing that we found is that their use, just merely their use without communication, can risk undermining a sense of privacy that teens need as they develop. And one girl said, I think she put something on my phone to watch me because I downloaded an app, and she asked me, what are you doing on that app? And the girl said, well, why are you invading my space like this? I need to be alone sometimes. And so what we see here is that potentially young people can feel that the technology is intrusive, and that, you know, in a way they don't have the freedom to make their decisions, to be on their own. And finally, we found young people talking quite a bit about trust and the way that feeling trusted by parents has been impacted by the use of monitoring technology. This is a great quote. This was quite heated conversations with my mom, especially because I felt I knew that my screen time wasn't affecting me. I wasn't really using my phone much. I just never did. But it felt more like I felt upset because she didn't trust me. So the use of parental controls without effective communication around them risks undermining the parent-teen relationship by demonstrating to the young person, well, I don't trust you to make your own smart decisions. I have to kind of enforce restrictions on you in order to keep you safe. And so I think these are great examples. There's probably a lot more that we can really dig down into in terms of unintended consequences as well as intended ones and how effective they are. But I think what we learn here is, we can't avoid talking about this issue. It's not like if parents just kind of subtly sneak in parental controls into a parent-child relationship, it's going to be just fine or kind of neutral outcome. It can have negative outcomes on young people in ways that we don't fully understand yet. So if we kind of think about all this together, we wanted to differentiate between two ways that young people can respond to parental control technologies. The first one is that they can be more collaborative, feel more collaborative, and the young person can then perhaps be more encouraged to cooperate with them. And we suspect, and I do think that there's more for us to learn here, but we suspect that when the technologies are used in a way that is communicated effectively, that is good explanations are given, good rationales, they're given with the perspective of the teen in mind, recognizing what their values are, what their goals are, and what their needs are, both, developmentally as they grow into the people that they're going to grow into, as they connect with peers and build relationships offline and online. So really having that understanding and using that as a basis for those communications is really, really important. It should be part of a shared family project. So, one of the ways to get collaboration is it's not a top-down exercise. So the parent says, well, this is how it's going to be. I'm going to put this on your phone and I'll be able to tell exactly what you're seeing online and I'll be able to turn off your phone at 7 o'clock. But it could be part of an exercise where, parents are saying, well, my goal is to safeguard you. I want to make sure you get to sleep on time, you're not too tired at school and so on. What's the right way for us to, to ensure that happens? And how do you feel about me putting on these devices to facilitate our doing that? So there are ways to develop that, that shared family project spirit, the collaborative spirit, working together. And part of that is answering mutual concerns. So, the parent's concern is to safeguard the kid, to make sure they are not put in the face of harm, that they're not exposed to things that will be, in a long way damaging to them, that they don't, I don't know. I wouldn't say get bad grades at school, but they're not too tired. They do well academically, they do well socially, they develop in a way that that will be good for them in the long run. So parents have those concerns, and young people have their own concerns, developing their identity, developing their relationships, learning who they are as independent people in the world outside of their family and parent relationships. And when parents and teens can collaborate together to recognize and understand one another, there's potential for using these technologies constructively. And what we see is, if that's not done, it could potentially lead to subversion, or to the young person then finding ways around any kind of parental controls. And that can happen when those technologies are used without any communication, when they're experienced by young people as obstacles to their developmental challenges, to the things that they need, to the things that they value, or if they reflect a distrust in the young person. No teenager wants to feel that their parent does not trust them to make their own decisions or to develop in the ways that they are moving to develop. They need to be empowered in those ways. And so to the extent that the use of the technologies reflects that distrust, it can create a break in the parent-child relationship. And just to kind of broadly discuss, and I'm also happy to pass this back to Katya at any point if you want to jump in, because I think discussion, it's probably something we could all do together as well. There's a lot going on here. But I think from my perspective, one of the key things to really address is, this research focused on adolescents, and actually relatively older adolescents. I think this is true going from early adolescence on, from childhood on, actually, increasingly true that the period of tween, I guess, let's say 8, 9, 10 and on, is a period where young people are becoming increasingly independent. They're learning what it means to be responsibly independent. They're developing their own identities, which aren't the identities necessarily that their parents gave them. Part of that is creating strong peer relationships, connecting with others around them who, are also going through this process, feeling part of a community, building those kind of networks. And so this is a key period where young people must learn to do those things, both fully so that they understand themselves in a social world, which is what we want from healthy functioning adults, but also in a way that allows them to think, okay, how do I make friends safely, responsibly? How do I make my own smart decisions? If I think about pursuing my hobbies or my interests, now that I have my own hobbies and interests, how do I do that in a way that still allows me to go to school and, engage and be thoughtful during the day and kind of function in the world that I need to function in? And so part of that is giving them the independence to make their own mistakes, to learn from those mistakes, to try out different things. And so this is a time when those kind of negotiations become really, really important and also a little bit tricky. So it's a really fascinating time for us to study. And also, I think within that kind of much, much bigger context, what we see is that parental controls affects the development and affects the parent-child or parent-teen relationship in ways that we're not fully recognizing and maybe don't fully understand yet. And it really has, and I think Katya spoke about this a lot, has affected also the way that parents care for teens. So they might actually be outsourcing some of the direct communications, the questions, when are you gonna come home, or what can I expect from you, or hey, did you kind of watch those things that you weren't supposed to watch? It outsources some of that to an automated process that is impersonal and doesn't necessarily conduce to conversations. So we want to make sure to keep those conversations, the dialogue between parents and teens going within the context of that automation. It has changed, kind of related to that, the nature of parent-teen negotiations. It makes it possible for parents to have more power within those negotiations because they can, with or without consent, collect data and create restrictions on behaviors in ways they never could before. It can affect perceived trust, and we talked about that as a kind of really important make it or break it within the parent-teen relationship, and within also kids wanting to be responsible because they feel trusted. And ultimately, it's kind of fundamentally speaks to teens' growing independence, their ability to do what they want to do when they want to do it, and also autonomy within that, which is the feeling of, if I care about something, if I value something, like connecting with my new friend who I really, really want to connect with, or learning more about this part of myself, or building this hobby, or pursuing knowledge I'm curious about, that they feel empowered to pursue those kinds of goals and values. With that, I think I'll pass it to Vicky to talk a little bit about policy.
Thank you. This is the last slide, and then we'll take some questions. But this has been such a fab project for me to be involved in, and I hope you're getting a sort of little sense of how our different disciplinary backgrounds, contribute, I think, to what is a sort of a whole that's much more than the sum of its parts. So, we, in many ways, some of the biggest contributions, I think, will first and foremost be the empirical contributions. So just to have a sense of how, as Katya described, these tools are being used in families in the UK, and what sort of patterns we are seeing at the level of culture, gender, demography, etc. The second aspect, I think, is having Netta on board, of course, is that we also, as part of that process, have a much better understanding, not just of the demographic patterns, but the implications for parenting and parent-child relationships. So in many ways, I think we could probably just stop there, and I feel really comfortable that we had a great project with great results. But as those of you who are at the OI know, so my personal fascination is really around policy and how we make policy, good policy, around the internet and digital technologies, and specifically children is, I suppose, the bit I'm really fascinated with. And what I've tended to look at in the past has been the adequacy of policy interventions from two perspectives. And one is just, if you like, sort of normative coherence. Does it make sense? Are the values that are espoused in this, do they sort of follow through when you actually look at the measures? But the second approach, which I've also really enjoyed in this case, has been sort of thinking empirically about, well, what research evidence do we have that seems to support these current sort of policy approaches? And so again, for me, this is what's made this a particularly interesting project. So obviously we haven't yet completed, I think, sort of all the final analysis. We may even manage to fit in one or two more focus groups. So these are sort of tentative observations so far, but you know, I guess these are sort of the headlines for me. So, you know, the first, and I feel this is probably sort of, I'm a broken record on this front around the OII, and in almost any policy conversation I'm ever engaged in on children and the internet. But it is, you know, the real importance of just avoiding these quite, you know, narrow, you know, blinkered, slightly naive views that technology can be a problem, but it can also be a somehow sort of magic bullet, if you like. So this idea that you just get the technology right and it'll solve these complex social problems. And, you know, for me, what this research really demonstrates is twofold. So one is that sheer variety of parenting situations we've talked about in the focus groups has reminded us yet again of how differently technologies are used by real people and the risks and opportunities that will come for that. But the second thing, I suppose, is if you get to the solutionism part, you know, I think it was very evident in a lot of those conversations that for some families, maybe these tools were working quite well if it seemed to sort of balance risk and opportunity and where everybody's happy with, you know, but in others, you know, it didn't seem to work and children were becoming, yes, distrustful, or the communication was breaking down, or they were subverting them. So that's the first thing, if you like. It sort of reinforces my view that we need to, you know, really hammer this message home that, yeah, technological solutionism in policy is not a good approach. The second thing, and this is where I particularly loved having Netta on board, is having this bigger appreciation for children's developmental needs in our policy making. So we have seen this in some areas. So those of you who work in data protection and product design might have been aware of the Age Appropriate Design Code, UK guidance introduced by the Information Commission's Office. And that does talk about ensuring that products and services are appropriate for children's developmental stages. But that's pretty much, you know, that's a real oddity. And one of the things that I think has really come through in this is first of all, the fact that the children and young people themselves talk about these products and services having different purposes at different ages. So parents, for example, you know, wanting to control, you know, use of apps and screen time much more at a younger age, and maybe locations being more important at an older age. So there's a demand, if you like, for age-appropriate advice and guidance. And then the other aspect, of course, from Netta's work, demonstrating how important it is that we are creating policies which respect children's developmental needs and interests. So that's come through really strongly for me. Equally, this question about autonomy supportive design, I mean, actually, again, little sort of aside, I suppose, working with the two of you has reminded me yet again how often we talk about one word, which we think we're all using the same way, only to find that we have radically different understandings of it. And autonomy is definitely one of those where there are different disciplinary sort of definitions, but I think we've got through that. But certainly, you know, again, if governments are really keen on introducing parental tools, tools to be used perhaps by adults with children or on children and young people. I think we're having very little conversation at the moment actually about what it would mean for those to be more autonomy supportive. So again, in things like the Age Appropriate Design Code, there's a bit of talk about things like transparency of using trackers. But that frankly seems to be a conversation that I think a lot of parents actually would, you know, probably would get on board with. So what would it mean for these tools to be more genuinely autonomy supportive for children and young people as they get older? The fourth around communication, this actually was one I literally never really thought about before, because there is so much emphasis on the types of resource you need to put in place to support policies and interventions around keeping children and young people safe online. And there has been a lot of attention, I think, over the years devoted to ensuring that there is guidance and support for parents. You know, they're a recognised stakeholder in this process. But what really came out of these focus groups for me was clearly we maybe we're getting half the message right. So we're sort of, these people are sort of understanding that maybe things like parental control tools are a good idea, but we're not telling them at all about how to have conversations with their children and young people about why they're necessary, when they're necessary, you know, what the benefits and risks might be. And so that seems to me to be actually quite a significant gap. And not to say that there aren't some charities or NGOs really sort of thinking that through, but I think at sort of the level of national policy, we could have much more focus on that. And then the last two, just quickly, I suppose. So, you know, too little focus on the evidence of efficacy. I mean, I would say that just as much, again, it's a general conclusion about policy making in this area. And partly it's because it's hard to get research evidence. And again, I think that was sort of demonstrated here, just the sheer variety of contexts in which these families, when children were using the technologies, would mean it'd be really difficult actually to be able to show across the population, you know, which tools were working well to counter which risks and with what trade-offs and so on. But in many ways, it reminded me that actually we often focus on the quantitative research as providing that evidence. And I think there is huge value in the sort of work that we've done here, as well as sort of providing much more sort of nuanced insight into personal circumstances and contexts which can support the quantitative work. And then last but not least, again, this might be familiar to some of you, for example, who've seen previous presentations by people like Julia Trupska at OII and Julia Neff. There is this bigger debate that Katja flagged at the beginning about this, of the ethical concerns in this context. And this isn't a project about that. That is work that's being done really well by other people. But the one empirical finding that I think, we do have, certainly from at least some of the children and young people in our sample, is, are these quotes where they don't see, a lot of them don't see anything wrong with the fact that their parents are tracking them, for example. Right. And so regardless of, whether you think tracking is a good or a bad thing, that normalization, that idea that this is something that you do in a family with loved ones, I just think that does merit slightly further consideration. So, yeah, I would like policymakers to think about that bit further too. But yeah, hopefully we'll have some more when we actually complete the project, but that's a little insight into where we've got. So, Katja, anything else you'd add, or was that?
No,
good for
I think this
questions?
is perfect. I'd like to
Good.
leave some time for questions and comments, given that this is working for.
Yeah.
I'm happy to, who's manning or womaning the mouse. So just in terms of housekeeping, we'll take questions. I usually, if there are questions coming in online, I'll take them I'll just alternate them, one from the room, one from online. And yeah, as long as let's jump into it. There's Anush, and then
Nothing here at the moment.
nothing. Okay, so we'll just go on with the room first. Anush, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much for this presentations and your kind of very nuanced treatment of this subject. So you highlighting pros and cons these technologies. And just to build on that last point, I think it's so important, and I appreciate that the study isn't about these broader concerns, but I couldn't help but think about the kind of broader societal implications of habituating, desensitizing people to being monitored, and in a way, in a kind of Huxleyan Brave New World, where people not just expect to be monitored and surveilled, but also actively invite these forms of surveillance. And I'm not saying we're there, but whether these kind of practices will might contribute to those kinds of experiences in the future, because there's so much in our societies these days about, constant monitoring and surveillance in many different ways. And what is your take on perhaps how to prevent that, and so children know that this is the context where it is appropriate, but this doesn't mean that it can be appropriate broadly.
I wonder whether actually it makes sense to ask you that question. So, for example, I would just completely agree with the comment. But if we were thinking about it, therefore, from a sort of an ideal design approach, how could you design either parental conversations or these tools such that children are aware of those trade-offs and wider risks?
Well, I mean, it's a good point. I think it's maybe if I can scale back a little bit, the first maybe important bit is thinking about intention and the way that intention is communicated to young people. So, if we think about parental controls, we can sort of think about them as a privilege that caregivers have, because they've been sort of given the responsibility of caregiving. And so they're sort of like bestowed the, and you're right that actually that mentality of I'm safeguarding you, and so I can use, I can collect data about you and restrict your behavior as part of that, with or without your consent, that can be scaled up at a society level in a way that probably is a little bit less healthy for us as independent people. But I think, within parent-child relationships, you say, well, I'm doing this because of this, and it's part of this process of negotiation, and there's some volition from the young person within that, so how would that work for you? What's a way that we can make it benefit both of us? Or what's a way that, feels pretty good to you within that? So encouraging that self-reflection, that volition, that active decision, collaborative decision-making rather than top-down decision-making probably helps. I don't know about desensitizing. It feels like, yes, maybe that's like, maybe there's something bigger than parent-child relationships here. But if we think about how to implement parental controls in a way that also teaches kids you have volition and you have choice within relationships where data are collected about you, or where rules are made about you with or without your consent, to help them be active in that process, might then model other relationships or other other contexts in adult life where they might be facing those kinds of like privacy invasions or behavioral restrictions. So, there is an argument to be made for role modeling and teaching teens and kids what it means to have data collected about them by parents doing this really well, where actually parental controls implemented effectively can sort of be an opportunity to have a healthy relationship with those kind of moments, I guess, that they might face in the future. I'm not sure if that is satisfying though, in terms, I think there's a slightly bigger concern that I don't know that I would know how to address, but I certainly think parents can do this as it's okay that things are done to you. Of course, they are parents and they're sort of given some power to do things to the kids that they care for. But if they can empower kids within that, it can be really healthy.
And the other thing I would add would be about schools. So I think one of the responsibilities for schools in terms of children's digital literacy education, I worry a little bit. There's often a focus at the moment on the risks of the, social media and social media companies. But I think it's really important that we wider conversations about things like privacy and data to include its collection and use by other parties, like even parents or, or schools actually themselves. Elaine here is online, who's made a comment about how actually a lot of this also applies to digital monitoring in other contexts, including CCTV, other types of behavioral academic monitoring, etc. So I think that's also a really useful observation that, there is space for wider.
Do we have questions
We
online?
do
Or
have
we go?
one on here. Do you want
So
to
maybe we
first?
take this one, then
Okay.
Meredith, and then Emma.
So Charlie asks,
Thank you.
did you find any differences in tracking behaviors or child reactions to tracking across different apps? In other words, due to differing functionalities? Because we did ask about this, didn't we? Ask about the different types of apps and things.
So, I mean, if I could jump into that one. So one of the biggest differences we saw was actually in location tracking and digital monitoring. So young people were a lot more open to the idea of location tracking. Some of them actively helped parents to set up location tracking. They're much more skeptical about digital monitoring. Some of it was the factor of those characteristics of digital monitor, of these characteristics of collaboration versus force enforcement. Location tracking was often done in collaboration. It wasn't just young person being observed by the parents, it was the parents observing young people. Digital monitoring was never done in that way. I don't think we had a single instance where the parents would share their digital activities and allow young people to track which websites the parents were visiting and things like that. That just didn't happen. So it was, some of it was the factor of that. In terms of within the same sort of Life 360 versus Apple iPhone, quite anecdotally, I think quite often the family aligned on a particular apps, like it was tracking using Life 360 or Find My iPhone, and the young people didn't get much of a chance to compare between different apps roughly with the similar functionalities. So if I missed anything.
So I think the other one was study aids, which they tended to put on themselves.
Yeah, there were those. I mean, there's a whole, I'm just worried of like exploding the conversation. There were examples of self-regulation that were very interesting, where young people used some of these apps for self-regulation. They were talking about when I had my GCSEs, some of them actively restricted themselves. And there's a universe, a small, usually 2 apps mentioned, where young people used that sort of temporarily block their phones while they were studying. So that happened. So I think if we had more time, we could talk, we could have another slide.
Hi. Building on Vivi's comment, actually, you mentioned it briefly. When I sort of look at how the digital sort of is starting to literally go in every single aspect of our social life, my main issue with it is ethical, but specifically autonomy. And what I always come back to really is digital literacy in education. Because to have that collaborative approach between children and parents, children should really know, these children know probably better than us how to use a mobile phone, but they may not know about identification, different marketing practices, health risks. And so I wonder what it's being done currently, policy-wise, to really teach these children you know, how to deal with technology, and equally also parents, because a lot of these monitoring technologies, they prey on you know, effective reasoning by the parents. You know, they feel like they have to do this to protect their child. They don't know actually what's happening to their child's data. Yeah.
We do
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Yeah, sure. So what is actually happening in the UK at the moment? So we have had media literacy in the national curriculum for quite some time, but I would say that it is very much in need of a refresh, and it's very much in need of a sort of concerted effort to devote more time and resources and expertise to it. So there's a couple of issues. So one is institutional. So I think at the moment it falls between the Department for Education and the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, who deals with online safety and risk, for example. A second is, you know, obviously things are changing very rapidly. So what would have been appropriate, you know, sort of 5 years ago, which might have been much more around sort of information literacy and, you know, what's an advert and what's the business model and so on, you know, now the sort of things we've just talked about today are, you know, quite far removed from that. I think there's certainly been a bit of a push in the last couple of years for data literacy in particular to be sort of a component of that. A lot of great work going on at LSE and with 5 rights around that. But it is, you know, it is interesting to me. So Ofcom, who is the regulator in the space, has a media literacy responsibility. Again, that's another institutional partner. So I think, you know, ideally we would have somebody championing it at sort of government level and sort of providing additional resource. Another question is around who delivers it. So, and is it a separate part of the curriculum, or actually does it just fit in with almost everything else you're teaching? So, you know, which is sort of my personal view. But so yeah, I think we all know it's needed. I actually think it's much harder to determine exactly how you deliver it and find the resource to do so. So I am optimistic that we are going to get better at doing this, frankly, in the next sort of 5 years or so. But yeah, it is a big need.
Can I add something to that, which is I think parents' media literacy is also a really important point you brought up, and they're a little harder to reach. And the kind of fascinating, I'm just speculating, but you know, I think parents are getting many more fear-based messages and much more pressure than they're getting constructive information from peers. And it is possible that sort of the move to like create blanket restrictions sort of overlooks a more constructive path to educating parents, which isn't sort of fear-based, get your kids away to keep them safe and keep them from being depressed or suicidal or anxious, but rather moves to how do we constructively engage these spaces that young people are exploring. And so there might be that a shift away from fear-based messages is sort of like a necessary first step to move towards media literacy in parents. And I think we're not seeing as much of that as we could be.
I think we don't have much there, so Emma.
Quickly, I was wondering if the three of you, or Netta specifically, could talk about teens seeing like digital monitoring technologies as simultaneously freeing yet also restrictive. Like, do you remember anyone from your focus groups kind of talking about the evolution of their thought process on that? Did they come into this technology originally thinking it was restrictive, but then kind of like re-ontologizing it, or did they kind of have this dual perspective from the get-go? I'm just really interested in kind of how they conceptualize that as teens, because it seems so contradictory to me.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak a little bit to that, but Katya, you'll be able to speak to the data more closely.
Had some thoughts.
Yeah, go for it.
But so if it's all right.
Yeah.
So we have quite consciously asked the young people about the current situation and whether they could reflect on how things evolved when they were younger. And we did get a number of messages where they said, well, back at the time I was really annoyed with something, but right now I think probably this was a good idea. So that was sometimes applied to digital monitoring. And they were also, there was a socio-demographic aspect to it. So one which was, I think I found quite striking, young people who disproportionately came from very disadvantaged neighborhoods, from schools also with high levels of free school meals, which is a measure of poverty in the UK, one of the measures. They were more likely to reflect upon direct experiences with unlimited, like YouTube watching, and either for themselves or for their younger siblings or cousins. And they've directly experienced, I mean, there was extreme examples with, 9 hours a day of quite young children spending watching online content, and how the behaviors change. So these young people were reflecting as well and having experienced that or saw that. They thought some level, some change was necessary. It shouldn't be, young people shouldn't be, very young kids shouldn't be left completely to their own devices. So that's what came to my mind.
Mhm. And for me, it was more kind of a maybe blanket, like perspective on this, which is, you know, I think the important thing to kind of keep in mind is that something I said at the start of my talk, that restrictions aren't always going to be felt as restrictive. So separating perception from sort of the objective amount of independence or freedom that a young person's given. And, you know, kind of extreme example, I guess, is, you know, a young person's told, every day you're coming home to this house because that's where you live. You're not allowed to go live in anybody else's house. And, you know, for most kids, that's not going to be felt to be restrictive. So I think sometimes that ambivalence isn't really there. It might feel just okay, autonomy supportive and aligned with their self, with their values, needs, and emotions, or it might have this tension that makes the restriction feel restrictive. And I think that differentiating that is really, really important for understanding kids' perspective. The perception is probably more important than the reality of how restricted they are.
One last, no.
Is there another
Should we,
question?
should we get the
online?
questions both together and then answer them quickly?
Okay, so
All
we've
right.
had
So-
Philip and
yeah.
also, oh, and then, so we got free, are we able to take free
I'm sure if
questions?
anybody needs to rush out, because
Then
it's 6:30
sneak
rush
out
out, we
and,
will finish
and-
in 5 minutes, shall
yeah,
we say that? Yeah. No,
And we'll try to
Okay.
respond more
Yeah.
succinctly, yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm still struggling to get my head around whether the advantages actually outweigh disadvantages. And to make it more concrete, seems like the technologies work in safe spaces, but they fail in unsafe spaces. So do the technologies undermine the development of agency in the children?
Mm, I think that's a great question. And I think in
Mine is a sampling question, and I wondered if you, in your sample, if you had measures of neurodivergence among the children, if that was something you took into account. And I'd just be interested to see how those variants. And the other variable I was interested in, do you collect some kind of measure, even self-reported, of the technical competence or literacy of the parents?
Okay, and the last question.
Extension of sampling questions as well. So I was pretty impressed like how a lot of teens actually reacted positively to these control methods. And I was wondering like what's the ratio of teens who reacted positively versus negatively? And also in the previous slide, I think I saw when kids reach age of 15, it goes up to 100% of like owning smartphones.
Yeah,
And I was wondering like how many parents would install this app to the kids' phones? If
okay,
you have that data.
thank you. I mean, I could speak
Go
to
for
maybe the
sampling ones.
quant,
Yeah, go
Sam,
for
I
it,
will
yeah.
go, I'll start on the sun. It's a very cool project. It's a, these are minors, but of a certain age. So because it's like the first project that we think anyone's done, used this sort of approach, it was an opt-in project and we didn't, so I think we don't have anyone who's neurodivergent, at least sort of self-declared or visible in a way that's visible to us. But I do think you're absolutely right in there is a whole universe there and these views should not be ignored in any way and experiences probably differ. So this is something that should be taken up in potentially both qual and quant ways.
I would just say, as the parent of a neurodivergent child who I track, there are real safety implications that are different from maybe other.
So I think we had a few very small comments on siblings who were neurodivergent. So our young people would say, well, the things are like that for me, and this is how it feels for me. But I have a brother or sister who has these needs, and they are clearly different. And I think anecdotally, you're right, but this study can't quite speak to that in a reliable way, but it is something that needs to happen. The tech components of the parents that definitely featured, we can't speak to any percentages. It definitely featured because we did have young people would say, oh, my parents don't use this technology, they wouldn't know how to install it. There were a few cases where the technology was used because it was installed automatically in the router, and then they changed the broadband company and they stopped using it because of that. And they were, very interestingly, in the young people from large families, we had commented in the situations, they tended to be from more disadvantaged backgrounds, and they were reflecting on having siblings who were like 8, 10 and more years younger. And we had some reflections where they said, my parents don't know how to do this. I think this is necessary. I'm doing it for my brother, which we didn't see very much in young people from like more middle class or like private schools at all.
Very brief answer to the last few.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is it a sampling of I forgot percent of parents? Young people being positive or negative. We can't speak to percentages, unfortunately. I'd have to think about it, but they can't answer shortly, and it's qualitative, so it wouldn't be reliable, unfortunately.
And then there was Philip's question at the beginning,
Which was technology potentially undermining agency.
Yeah.
You want to
was
speak?
it or
Oh,
the
like on
cost?
autonomy. I thought that this were.
Yeah, so is it that the costs might outweigh the benefits? Was that the, did I
Well,
remember that
if
correctly?
you block critical content at home,
Mhm.
but children are confronted with that at their friend's house.
Yeah.
Then they have no place to go to
Yes.
talk about what they've seen there.
Yes, that's, you're right. But actually, do you know the kind of phrasey thing, given how important it is that there's not a lot of data on that. You know, there are sort of studies that suggest that kids and teens especially can get around restrictions, and then they find their way to dangerous content anyway. And you're absolutely right that they're not set up either to know how to make, I think I can maybe speak a little bit for the three of us here, but that they're not set up to know how to make smart decisions for themselves because they haven't had the practice. And also if they see something they don't like, they might be less likely to return to the parent and then say, I was exposed to something because actually they weren't supposed to be there in the first place. And they're not in a kind of mutually trusting relationship in the same way. But there's so little research on this. So we need more of that, because actually the consequences are the harms might outweigh the benefits. And we don't have enough data speaking to that yet, but we're kind of acting like we do.
Yeah,
a little
like
bit.
this we do. So all the studies we've seen are short term. Like today there's a blocker. The child today saw less potentially pornography, but it's like the long term that we don't see much about.
So we need to finish it there. If you have any questions, obviously you're very welcome to approach any of us either now or just separately by email after. But thank you so much for coming on a rainy, whatever it is, Tuesday evening. Thank you. Thanks for everyone.